I can still remember the second before I chose silence. Not the argument, not the words that were said, but the pause that came right before I responded. That brief space where I realized I was about to explain myself again. To soften something that already felt fragile. To turn a feeling into something easier to accept. And in that pause, something inside me hesitated. Not out of fear, but out of exhaustion. Until then, speaking had felt like effort, but silence felt like failure. I believed that if I stopped talking, something would be lost. Clarity, connection, my place in the room. So I kept finding words, even when they didn't feel honest anymore. I explained my tone. I explained my reactions. I explained why something mattered. Each explanation felt necessary at the time, like proof that I was still trying. What I didn't realize was how heavy that effort had become. Not loud, not dramatic, just constant. I could feel it in the way my thoughts slowed before I spoke, as if they needed permission first. In the way I adjusted my words mid-sentence, anticipating discomfort before it arrived. I wasn't speaking freely anymore. I was negotiating my presence. That moment came quietly. No raised voices, no final statement. Just the familiar expectation that I would explain myself. Again. And the sudden awareness that I didn't have to. The words were there, ready, practiced. But for the first time, I noticed what came with them. The shrinking, the carefulness, the way I disappeared a little every time I spoke. So I didn't say anything. Not to punish, not to withdraw. But because silence, in that moment, felt more honest than another explanation. It felt like the only way to stay intact. And as the space between us filled with nothing, I understood that silence wasn't absence at all. It was a boundary I had never allowed myself to have. After that moment, I didn't feel relief the way I imagined I might. Silence didn't arrive like peace. It arrived like unfamiliar territory. I was used to filling spaces, smoothing edges, making sure nothing lingered too long without explanation. Without words, I suddenly became aware of how often I had been managing the atmosphere. Not just conversations, but the emotional climate itself. Silence exposed that habit in a way explanations never had. I began to notice how much of my identity had been built around being understandable, being clear, being reasonable, being easy to respond to. I had learned, slowly and without realizing it, that being heard often required being palatable. So I translated myself. I framed emotions carefully. I preempted misunderstandings before they could exist. What I didn't question was why that responsibility felt so one-sided. Looking back, it wasn't that my words were ignored. They were received, politely, calmly, without resistance. And that was the problem. Nothing changed. Explaining had become a closed loop. Effort without movement, clarity without closeness. Each time I spoke, I felt a subtle distance remain exactly where it was, as if understanding and care were no longer connected in the same way. Silence made that distance visible. Without my words acting as a bridge, there was nothing left to soften the gap. No reassurance, no interpretation, just the raw shape of the space between us. And in that space, I felt something unsettling, not abandonment but imbalance. A quiet realization that I had been carrying more than my share of the emotional weight. I didn't choose silence to provoke a reaction. I chose it because I needed to hear what existed underneath all my explanations. I needed to know whether connection could survive without my constant translation. Whether presence would still move toward me if I stopped making myself easier to meet. That question lingered, unresolved and uncomfortable. And it was the first honest thing I had allowed myself to feel in a long time. At first, silence felt like a test I hadn't prepared for. Not something I announced, not something I defended, just something I allowed to exist. I noticed how quickly my instincts tried to correct it. A pause would stretch, and my mind would rush to fill it with context, clarification, reassurance. I had to resist that urge deliberately, reminding myself that silence was not a mistake to fix, but a choice to sit with. What surprised me was how exposed I felt without words. Explaining had always given me a sense of control. As long as I spoke, I could guide the meaning, soften reactions, anticipate misunderstandings. Silence removed that layer of protection. It left my feelings unguarded, standing on their own without translation. That vulnerability was uncomfortable in a way I wasn't used to. I started noticing how often explanations had acted as a buffer. They filled the space where curiosity should have lived. They replaced questions that were never asked. I realized how rarely someone leaned toward me without being invited by my words first. Without explanations, I was no longer leading the interaction. I was waiting to see if anyone else would step forward. Waiting changed the way time felt. Moments stretched. Small gaps became noticeable. I became acutely aware of how much effort I had once invested in keeping things smooth and uninterrupted. Silence slowed everything down, and in that slowness, patterns that had been invisible before began to surface. I noticed how easily I used to take responsibility for discomfort. If something felt tense, I assumed it was mine to ease. If a mood shifted, I believed it was my role to clarify. Without speaking, I had no way to intervene. All I could do was observe, and that observation was quietly revealing. There were moments when the silence was met. A question would appear. A pause would be acknowledged. Those moments felt unfamiliar but grounding, like discovering that reciprocity was possible without prompting. They were rare, but they mattered, because they showed me what connection could feel like when effort moved in both directions. More often, though, nothing happened. The silence remained untouched. And in that stillness, I felt a mix of disappointment and clarity. Disappointment because part of me still hoped my absence of words would be noticed. Clarity because I was no longer mistaking my own effort for mutual engagement. I began to understand how explaining had shaped my expectations. I had grown used to believing that connection required constant maintenance, mostly from me. Silence challenged that belief. It asked a quieter question. What remains when you stop holding everything together yourself? That question followed me, even outside those moments. I noticed it in other conversations, other spaces. How often I filled gaps reflexively. How rarely I allowed silence to reveal what was truly present. Choosing silence wasn't changing the world around me, but it was changing what I could see. I wasn't empowered yet. I wasn't free, but something had shifted irreversibly. Silence had become information. And once I learned how to listen to it, I knew I couldn't return to explaining the way I used to, not without noticing the cost. Silence began to change the way I saw myself in the room. Without the habit of explaining, I noticed how often I had been positioning my emotions in ways that made them easier to accept. I used to enter conversations already prepared to adjust, to soften, to clarify. Now, without that preparation, I felt exposed. Not because I was saying less, but because I was no longer protecting myself with words. There was a subtle discomfort in that exposure. Not panic, not fear. Just the quiet awareness that I could no longer manage how I was perceived. Explaining had given me a sense of authorship over the situation. Silence removed that illusion. It forced me to confront the possibility that understanding and care might not arrive simply because I made myself understandable. I began noticing how my body responded in those moments. A slight tightening in my chest when a pause stretched too long. The familiar impulse to rescue the interaction before it felt awkward. Choosing silence required restraint, and that restraint felt like learning a new language, one that didn't rely on persuasion or clarity to exist. What became clearer with time was how asymmetrical things had been. I had been adapting constantly, while the space around me remained unchanged. Silence revealed that imbalance without commentary. There was no argument to defend against, no misunderstanding to correct. Just the quiet fact that effort had been moving in one direction far more than the other. In some moments, the silence felt almost tender. It allowed me to feel my emotions without immediately reshaping them. Sadness didn't need to become reasonable. Discomfort didn't need to be justified. I could simply experience what was there, unfiltered and incomplete, without rushing to make it acceptable. Other moments were harder. Silence left room for doubt to surface. Questions I had avoided with explanations now lingered without resolution. Was I valued or merely accommodated? Was my presence wanted or simply tolerated as long as it remained easy? These questions didn't demand answers, but they refused to disappear. I realized how often I had equated being understood with being safe. Explaining had been my way of securing that safety. Without it, I had to face the possibility that safety might depend on something else entirely. Mutual attention, willingness, care that moved without prompting. There were times when I felt the urge to retreat completely. Silence, when misunderstood, can feel like rejection, even when it's chosen. I worried that by saying nothing, I was making myself invisible. But slowly, I began to see the difference between invisibility and restraint. One erases you, the other protects what remains. Silence wasn't teaching me how to be distant. It was teaching me how to stop overextending, to let the space between people reflect reality instead of effort, to allow interactions to reveal their true shape, even when that shape was uncomfortable to acknowledge. I hadn't reached clarity yet. I was still navigating uncertainty. But one thing had become undeniable. Explaining had kept me busy, but silence was showing me the truth. And once I started seeing it, I knew the story couldn't return to what it was before. By then, silence was no longer just a response. It had become a mirror. Every time I chose not to explain, something reflected back at me. Not always what I wanted to see, but always what had been there all along. Without words smoothing the edges, interactions revealed their weight. Some felt balanced. Most did not. I began to notice how much energy I had once spent anticipating reactions. Explaining had been a way to stay ahead of disappointment, to soften outcomes before they arrived. Silence removed that advantage. I had to experience moments as they were, without editing them in advance. That felt risky, but it also felt honest. There was a particular heaviness in realizing how often my explanations had been mistaken for connection. I had believed that effort meant closeness, that if I kept showing up with clarity and patience, something would eventually meet me halfway. Silence exposed the flaw in that belief. Effort alone does not create intimacy. Sometimes it only hides the absence of it. I noticed how my absence of words was received, sometimes with confusion, sometimes with indifference, rarely with curiosity. Those responses told me more than explanations ever had. They showed me where attention naturally flowed, and where it didn't. What once felt ambiguous began to feel defined. There were moments when I almost returned to old habits, moments when the discomfort felt too sharp, too revealing. Explaining would have been easier, familiar. It would have allowed me to pretend nothing had changed. But once silence had shown me the pattern, pretending became impossible. I started feeling the weight of choice more clearly. Not just the choice to speak or remain silent, but the choice to keep participating in dynamics that required me to shrink. Silence made that cost visible. Each unspoken moment carried a question I could no longer avoid. What am I preserving by staying this way? There was grief in that question. Not the kind that demands release, but the kind that settles quietly in the body. Grief for the version of myself that believed being endlessly understandable was the same as being valued. Grief for the time spent translating feelings that were never going to be met with the care I hoped for. I realized then that silence was not a withdrawal from others. it was a return to myself, a way of stopping the constant negotiation of my own worth. Without explanations, I could finally feel the full shape of my emotions, uneven, unresolved, but intact. The more I stayed with silence, the clearer things became. Not clearer in a comforting way, but in a grounded one. I could see where effort was reciprocated and where it dissolved. I could feel when my presence was welcomed and when it was merely endured. That clarity was heavy, but it was also stabilizing. I hadn't reached the end of the story yet. Nothing had been resolved, but I was standing much closer to a truth I could no longer ignore. Silence had stripped away the illusion that explaining could fix imbalance. And in that quiet recognition, I felt the threshold of something final approaching. Not a decision made in anger, but one shaped slowly by awareness. I didn't become someone new when I chose silence. I didn't grow stronger overnight. What changed was quieter than that. I stopped abandoning myself in moments where presence was one-sided. I stopped believing that my feelings needed translation to be valid. Silence didn't solve anything. It simply allowed things to be seen without distortion. And once I saw them clearly, I understood that returning to endless explanations would cost me something I was no longer willing to give. There is a particular kind of dignity in choosing not to speak when words only serve to make you smaller. Not as punishment, not as defense, but as respect for your own inner weight. Silence, I learned, is not emptiness. It is space. Space where effort reveals its direction. Space where imbalance no longer hides behind clarity. And in that space, I felt something unfamiliar but grounding. The sense that I didn't need to convince anyone of what I felt in order for it to matter. If you stayed with this story until now, thank you. Truly. Some stories don't offer answers because they trust the listener to recognize themselves without being told what to do. If something here felt close or uncomfortably familiar, know that you're not alone in that quiet awareness. There are more stories like this, not louder, not simpler, just honest in the same restrained way. I'll be here for the next one, and if you return, we'll sit with whatever needs to be noticed next, without rushing to explain it.